Good morning and welcome to AirSage's Brewing Data. My name is Robert Kohler, and I want to thank you for tuning in to learn more about data today. A little bit about myself. I'm the CRO at AirSage and a professional transportation planner with about 2 decades of experience in the transportation and big data worlds. Today, we're going to be covering some really interesting topics: mobility and user behavior, the importance of micromobility, and also sustainability and the future of mobility on demand as a service, also known as MoDaaS. With that, I would like to introduce you to our guest today, Galo Bowen. Galo is an Ecuadorian-American author, a licensed professional engineer, and a technology evangelist. He's the vice chair of the American Society of Civil Engineers Technical Committee on MoDaaS. He authored Mobility 2040, Exploring the Emerging Trends Radically Transforming Transportation Systems in the U.S., which was released back in April of 2021. I'm excited to introduce Galo Bowen to the show today. Hello, and good morning, Galo.
Good morning, Robert. Thank you so much to you and to AirSage for having me for this discussion.
Definitely, thanks. So thanks for joining us, but I have a really big list of questions today, so I want to make sure we can jump right in. So without further ado, I will begin right with introducing topics on mobility and user behaviors, which dovetails with your recent book, Mobility 2040. And I'm curious to know, what inspired you to write about mobility? What was your main agenda for writing the book and having it published?
Sure. For as long as I can remember, I've always been intrigued in the topic of transportation, on how people move around. And, like many others, I've gotten to, witness firsthand some of the pressing challenges impacting U.S. transportation systems and their users. So, like hectic traffic congestion, long commutes, parking difficulties, a lack of a robust, reliable, and accessible public transit system and infrastructure, many of which I'm sure many of us can relate to. And, on top of that, you hear that more than 40,000 people die every year, in crashes on U.S. roadways, which is something outrageous to me. You realize that transportation is the sector of the U.S. economy with the largest share of greenhouse emissions, with nearly 1/3. And then, you read and you hear about all these, negative effects creating not only to the environment, but on people's health, right? So, I'm looking at this dysfunctional, fragmented transportation system in a country that, quite a paradox, is arguably the most developed nation on earth. The leader in, rapidly evolving industries, technological advances. So I'm asking myself, why does a very developed country like the United States is facing, a series of transport converging crises, if you will? So how do we arrive to this predicament that U.S. transportation is broken, but more importantly, what actions can be taken to solve these transportation issues? So, how can we reinvent, if you will, transportation in the U.S.? What lessons, best practices can be taken from a technology and also regulatory standpoint from other parts of the globe and system? So, because on the brighter side, we are in a period where, emerging technologies such as, big data, artificial intelligence are all touching and gradually transforming transportation through, the so-called mobility trends, many of which we'll be talking, in this discussion. And, many innovative companies in this space are already making very exciting progress to alleviate these challenges. So as for my motivation and agenda, for writing this book, really what I wanted and what I want is to be, for my book to be a rallying call for everyone who shares the mission of transforming U.S. transportation systems, and again, addressing all the, current environmental and societal impacts. And as I mentioned in my book, it's for the investor who is looking for the first mover's advantage in this dynamic space, but it's also for policymakers who, whose decisions will shape the path that we take for years to come. It's for, private mobility companies, startups, and OEMs that make development possible. And, finally, it's for American commuters in general, right, whose hearts we must win to realize a better transportation future, and for the country in general.
Yeah, that's a good point. It really takes everybody coming together, the stakeholders, policymakers, the people that can implement these changes and transition into embracing new mobility or other things that can improve our society. And I definitely appreciate your time taking to write that book and hopefully getting it out there to more and more people so they can make better informed decisions to improve the conditions over what we have today. How would you say the transportation industry in the US has evolved from traditional transportation networks from years ago into modern ones over the past 5 to 10 year period?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen like we've all seen hybrid vehicles now, fully electric vehicles, and followed by again some of these emerging technologies like big data, AI, the Internet of Things. They have been gradually entering the transportation industry, like you're saying, within the past say like 5 years. So I think that from a technology standpoint, the transportation sector has had a significant leap over the past years. And if we focus specifically, on big data, right, with the explosion of data coming from mobile devices, software companies are able today to leverage to collect anonymized data and generate key insights across transportation planning and traffic engineering to create an overall positive impact in transportation through this data collection on travel behavior. Companies, startups, they can take today, or they can identify the ideal placement for say a bus stop, an electric vehicle charging infrastructure station, a bike lane, a pedestrian crossing, by determining walking and biking activity patterns. So I would say that use cases that are possible, that were not possible say 10 years ago, are possible today because we have reached this breakthrough in emerging technologies, right? So similarly with artificial intelligence is playing a key role in transportation through traffic management solutions. I think like we all use the Wazes and the Google Maps of the world, that help us to provide key insights on road blockages and the shortest routes. And again, if we focus on the entrance of these ride-hailing, ride-sharing companies, the same with micromobility, shared bikes, electric scooters, these are first and last mile microtransit solutions as well. And the integration of these technologies in new mobile app development has certainly been a game changer for the capabilities of services in the transportation space, and of course for the large number that these services can reach, right? A lot of attention has also been centered on the efforts taken by OEMs on their path to the deployment of fully autonomous self-driving vehicles for a more effective, convenient, and safer transportation. And I would also say that in more recent years, there are private companies and startups as well as public transit agencies that have been exploring and investing in the development of mobility as a service, MaaS solutions on these digital platforms that will let users plan, book, and pay for a travel journey all at once. And personally, what I consider the future of transportation to be, the integrated multimodal transportation customized to each user. So overall, I would say that there have been so many, up and coming tech and mobility companies right now that are energizing the transportation space. So I would say that while there have been important, technological advancements in transportation with good initial success, there's still a lot to be done. We can't just be satisfied celebrating some of the early victories like the ride-sharing apps. I think that the bipartisan, infrastructure deal that was signed this past November speaks to this sense of urgency to fix American infrastructure, to improve public transit systems, and invest in safer, more sustainable, accessible, and inclusive transportation system.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Over the past, 5 to 10 years, we've seen a lot of new technologies come out that couldn't have even been thought about 20 years ago when I began my career. And they're helping us plan better. And, maybe transit lines and extensions, we can now look at common origin destination pairs with easily acquired data. And that can help bridge the gap of where people are not getting between today and where they might be able to more easily get between in the future. So how do you think transformation towards sustainability and sustainable mobility can succeed in urban planning, the whole transport system, and also mobility culture?
Sure. Yeah, I think that we can approach this question from many different angles. So I think that efforts need to be taken in making cities more walkable, European style, if you will, right? Replacing parking lots in prime real estate with parks and green areas. prioritizing sustainable transportation modes such as bikes, electric scooters, over the use of the privately owned car. And this requires, of course, a redesign of cities infrastructure and built environment. You cannot expect people to give up on driving their vehicles and decide to use micromobility options if no bike lanes are in place, for example, right? And I think that startups in the big data and transportation space can provide a lot of value, to urban planners, because like I was saying earlier, based on people's travel patterns, identify those areas where there's a high biking activity, so that new bike lanes can be built. Another key factor for sustainable mobility in this transformation, I would say, it's the implementation of, again, like an efficient public transit system. According to by APTA numbers, communities that invest in public transit lower the country's carbon emissions, I think, by 37 million metric tons annually. And public transportation is much more reliable and effective, in Western European cities than it is in the U.S. Also, maybe with a few exceptions, like New York City, that can be comparable. But and this also largely explains why there is a higher car dependency in U.S. cities, and of course the associated vehicular carbon emissions. So I think that investments in public transit, from a fleet quality perspective, but also from an operational standpoint, meaning improved bus routes and headways, are necessary to help increase transit ridership as we move away from as we help reduce personal car driven miles and lower carbon emissions. And of course the transition towards electric vehicles for private and commercial use, not only for urban planning but for the entire transport system, and particularly relevant for haul trucking, right, covering large distances. So I think that battery technology advancements to increase battery range, in addition to the deployment of a robust charging infrastructure network, will drive the full implementation of EVs at a large scale. And if we focus on suburban or rural areas, because we tend to focus on urban planning, but there's also a lot of people living in again, suburbs and rural areas. I think like car sharing and micro transit solutions are all helping to minimize the number of personally driven miles and the overall level of vehicular carbon emissions. So I think that it's important to know that investments in public transportation are driven by regulatory support, favorable legislations, as we're seeing again with the bipartisan infrastructure deal, that is putting huge emphasis on revitalizing U.S. infrastructure and transit systems. So, because again, technology alone will not solve the problem, right? I think like all these breakthrough and innovation have been possible because, again, there has been regulatory support. So, and like to answer the question of mobility culture, I think that I think that's a very interesting topic, because the modern history of U.S. transportation system has taught us that, again, it was built around a privately owned car. So on top of being the norm, cars have become a cultural symbol, linked with the idea of freedom. So I think that, of course, there's a culture battle that we need to address and overcome it to achieve this mobility revolution with sustainability at the core.
Yeah, you brought up one really good point that resonates with me is reliability and the headways for transit. And for a commute, especially, people are more prone to driving if the headways are poor, or if it's not a one-seat ride and the headways are poor. It makes it much more difficult for somebody to consciously make the choice to have a commute in public transport rather than a single occupant vehicle. So I definitely get that. And to that end, do you think that people are prone to changing their behavior today as it relates to mobility options? What are the motivations and factors that influence the behavioral change in travel pattern?
Sure. No, I think that people can be influenced, on their travel behavior. And, as a matter of fact, I think we're already seeing some early signs of this, especially, among younger people and in urban settings. The percentage of, American 16-year-olds with a driver's license has been in decline, from 2008 to 2018, there was a drop of about 6 points, from like 31 to 25%. And for comparison purposes only, if we go back to the 80s, nearly half of the 16-year-old population had a driver's license in hand. So even though, yes, age restrictions, vary by state, I think the decline in the interest to, lawfully drive is evident, right? And while there can be many, reasons to explain this trend, I think that one reason for this decline is the technological advancements and new mobility solutions available to not only 16-year-olds but the overall population. Micromobility, again, ride sharing, microtransit services, can all offer a convenient and also cost-effective alternative to owning a personal car, right? Which comes rather at an elevated price, especially when you start adding say required insurance premiums, licensing, registration costs, maintenance and repair costs, right? So all of this for an asset that is generally parked 90% of the time or more, right? And now with the pandemic, and with the option that many have to work remotely and avoid those long commutes every day, I feel like more people, especially those living in cities, they're asking themselves whether it makes sense to invest in a brand new car that will be barely used and that is also expensive to own. And if you're in a city like Washington D.C. where I am, the monthly cost to garage your car, say in an apartment or condo building, will also be very high, right? So I think the financial benefit also is the best way to motivate large numbers of people. It makes it a practical change, instead of being a charitable, if you will, or solely environmental conscious decision, right? And aside from the financial benefit, I think that given the perception that of a private car's freedom of mobility, again, like I was saying earlier, advancements in mobility as a service can help shape travel behavior by ensuring this freedom of mobility, but by offering choice. So I think that if properly implemented, MaaS can provide the same level of freedom as a personal car, allowing people to integrate distinct transportation modes, public and private, and optimize your trips based on real-time needs and conditions without the need to, carry the high cost of car ownership.
Yeah, I've seen these different options change over time, and I think the data that's being fed back to the operators is helpful for them to streamline their business model and make it more adaptable to the ever-changing needs we all have. And I think during COVID, people were more inclined to take some sort of micro-mobility platform as opposed to maybe mass public transport. And I think there will be more of a dynamic between the two, and hopefully an interrelationship between the two for first mile, last mile, coupling with the micro-mobility type things. So obviously micro-mobility is quite important, but we continually hear about how micro-mobility should be regulated, and typically that's coming from opponents. Why is regulation for shared mobility such an important topic? Do you think that anything should be improved in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for any, not only micromobility, but for any mobility solution, the right balance between innovation and regulation is important. I think, adequate regulation is key to help, mobility options to meet broader societal and environmental goals other than the obvious, profit motive. It's important to, ensure that accessibility for the economically disadvantaged, right, or the disabled community, for example, right? So to mitigate this disparity in transportation access, an increasing number of cities are requiring mobility companies to disperse their vehicle solutions in low income on underserved neighborhoods or across the entire city. And we're talking about micromobility, and in Washington D.C., where I live, for example, it's a requirement to have electric scooters in every ward, right? Some jurisdictions require companies, again, not only micromobility but also TNC in general, to offer diverse payment options, considering low income people tend not to have a smartphone, right, or a credit card. They kind of put a deposit down. And what's very important when it comes to regulation, I think it's lies in data privacy, because with the unprecedented amounts of data coming from, again, mobile devices, it's important to ensure that that it's done in an anonymized way without revealing any personal details. So regulations help ensure that shared mobility options are deployed in a manner that protects consumers, right, from unwarranted privacy risks. So yeah, I think that regulation is particularly important to achieve these larger societal and environmental goals. And as far as what can be improved in this space, I think that close and continuous collaboration between private and public sectors is key. At the end, like I was saying earlier, innovation will not go far without regulatory support, not only in transportation, but across all industries. So, while I'm not in favor of completely deregulating transportation for some of the reasons previously exposed, I think that it's important to recognize the efforts that private mobility companies are putting into bridging some of, again, these pressing societal environmental goals, right, with accessibility also. And in my opinion, there's also a barrier from a messaging standpoint, how technology and mobility innovation can help fix US transportation while also addressing, again, all these societal challenges. It's not something, necessarily easy to explain in clear terms and to educate and persuade regulators, right? So they're in favor of these types of innovations. But I think, various entities, universities, organizations, they can provide great value to help promote innovation with a purpose, based on, research findings. And that's also, precisely what I attempt to do with my book, right? Explore these different emerging technologies and mobility trends, reflect on some of the opportunities for advancement, and explain how, by leveraging all these and with the, mobility stakeholders already in place, including, again, regulators and, transportation systems, can be really, revitalized to drive mobility for all.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sometimes we even revert back to very old technologies that were proven, such as getting a streetcar. We have streetcars coming back in DC. They came back about a decade or so ago. And I think those are a great way to transport more people and connect them with the things that they need to. And not that that's micromobility, but to what degree can micromobility trips bridge that first mile and last mile gap? What are the implications of micromobility for public transport?
I would say that at a high degree overall, right? We've seen over the past years, particularly in urban areas, how shared micromobility systems like scooters and bikes, both docked and dockless, are serving as a more efficient transport mode to the car, especially for those shorter trips. So in a city like DC or New York City, it's not surprising to be sitting in your car, in traffic for like 30, 40 minutes or more during rush hour, or maybe 1 or 2 miles of travel. So and interestingly enough, 60% of car trips in the U.S. are less than 5 miles. Many of which could clearly be substituted by micromobility options. And just as an anecdote, I remember when I was living in Baltimore, back in 2013, 14. One of my good old friends from college back then had just moved there, and he was having daily commutes of 1 hour at least through driving, by driving through downtown Baltimore from his office to his house, his apartment, and these two were only 3 miles apart, right? So then after 1 or 2 weeks, he started, what he realized is that there was a free water taxi that would take you from the southern to the north side of the city. So what he would do is, he just got a bike, like a personal bike. He would drive, he would ride the bike for like 5-7 minutes to the closest water taxi station, cross the river in less than 10 minutes, and then he would just walk for the last stretch of his trip. And so, in that case, a privately owned bike, because again, these bike docking programs were not so popular back then. But it was significant, the effect that it was taking, right? It was saving him a good 30 minutes of commute time, in addition to all these, gas costs and the stress that a lot of us experience when in hectic traffic conditions. So due also to their superior convenience and affordability, I think like scooters, these bike sharing programs have become a very attractive mode of transportation and, an effective connector to transit. Also, transit authorities, they are increasingly deploying, bike docking stations, a minimum number of scooters at metro and subway stations for people to use them for that, first and last mile connection, right? And to make it easier for people to access transit. So, and what I would also like to add that, yes, shared micromobility systems get the attention, but also these privately owned options, for instance, you have these 4-wheel power scooters, they're helping especially the elderly and the handicapped, right? To have easier access to public transit. And again, more effective and seamless transportation overall.
Yeah, and that really indicates there's a multitude of different micromobility options out there based on even age and what one user abilities might allow. To that effect, we've all heard about many different accidents with people using micromobility modes. How do risks of using micromobility modes compare to each other or even to other activities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll start by saying that any transportation mode, micromobility included, brings risks, right? For accidents and crashes. But for example, and as I mentioned earlier, the stats on the number of crashes and deaths for, associated to vehicles tends to be overlooked. I think to everyone, 40,000 people dying every year on U.S. roadways due to car accidents. It should be something, scandalous to say the least, right? But you don't see a lot of questioning in this regard. So at least not in my opinion. And according to again also APTA's figures, using public transit will instead of a car reduce a person's chance of being in an accident by more than 90%. Something to keep in mind. And when it comes to micrommobility, of course there are risks. But one caveat to your question is that the built environment contributes to the safety of micromobility solutions, right? So riding a scooter or a bike in DC, New York City, or Seattle, where there's a significant deployment of bike lanes, will always be safer than riding a scooter, or a bike that at a place where that lacks an allocated protected space, right? Similarly, the condition of the pavement would always, make it easier and safer for people, without any potholes or surface defects. So I think that part of making micromobility a safer mobility option is also by providing the necessary surrounding infrastructure. And many different measures are being taken in this space to make micromobility, again, like a safer transportation option through regulating, the maximum speed, for example, right, for electric scooters. Or a few scooter apps will require people to upload a driver's license to make sure that, like an 8 or a 10-year-old is not unlocking the device. Users are also required to wear a helmet. At least companies, on their apps, they're doing their job at disclosing these norms that are meant to be followed by riders. And I think that the issue of micromobility mode should not distract us from addressing risks that vehicles pose for all other road users. When scooters, bikes, bike riders, and pedestrians, they share the space with motor vehicles, there should be speed regulations implemented as well, right? Widespread training for bus, truck drivers to avoid crashes with micromobility riders. So again, yes, micromobility, yes, it has its risk. No transportation mode is riskless. But again, micromobility, it brings also a series of benefits, which I referred to earlier. So the focus should be really, on how to minimize these risks.
That's great. And I know we're running very close to the end of time here, but I do have one question I want to kind of jump into regarding sustainability and the future of MoDaaS. What do you think urban mobility will look like in about 10 years from now?
Sure. So, I think that with the emerging technologies and, mobility trends that, again, we've discussed today, I know we didn't talk too much on mobility as a service, but, all these like projections in the advancements of the same and, more importantly, I would say with the real common desire by private, public sector, government stakeholders to radically transform transportation system, I imagine urban mobility as more like seamless, where people will become more multi-modalists, by integrating or at least having the option to, integrate various transport modes, right, as they are deployed. I envision an improved built environment, with roadways repurposed for mass transit and, micromobility products as a balance of, commuter volume will gradually shift from cars towards, buses, shuttles, bikes and scooters. And, I see urban mobility as more sustainable with a much higher, percentage of personal and commercial vehicles electrified. The rapid advancement, again, like we were saying, OEMs are making in this space, and also the regulatory, zero emissions mandate, government mandate speaks to this too. More automated mobility, OEMs and tech companies, they're putting, tremendous efforts through various use cases to achieve level 5, full autonomy. So I will say that we will reach that stage in mobility where the environmental and societal transportation challenges will see tangible alleviation. And I want to make the point that these changes take time. So even in 2030, we should not expect all problems to be solved, but we should surely, remain focused on the, on the mission and celebrate those victories that I'm sure we will achieve, throughout the years, as we get to the transportation state that all our communities desire and all deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's definitely a way forward we've come a long way in the past 5 to 10 years, and I think there's a lot of things we can continue to do, iterate on, and just continue to make society and life better. But it's been so great having you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been very informative, and I've had a very wonderful time speaking with you. But hopefully our guests and viewers have also learned a lot from the show today. But before we leave, I just want to say that I hope everybody can join us next week when we have Julie White on the show. Julie is the Deputy Secretary for Multimodal Transportation at North Carolina Department of Transportation. She has more than 2 decades of public sector service and currently oversees the rail, aviation, ferry, and integrated mobility divisions at NCDOT. She's been awarded the WTS Women in Transportation Community Advocate Award, the NCDOT Road Gang Award, and the Triangle Business Journal's Women in Business Award. Julie also serves on the board of directors for APTA and is the chair of the Southeast Rail Corridor Commission. With that, I wish you all an amazing day and weekend. Come join us next week for another Brewing Data. Thanks a lot.